The Price of a Silent Reputation. Section 1. The Email. Everyone read before I did. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor usually takes exactly 44 seconds. I know this because I've spent the last 12 years counting them. In the world of high-stakes legal consulting, time isn't just money, it's the only objective truth we have left. I stepped out into the lobby of Sterling & Hale, adjusting my tie in the reflection of the glass doors. The receptionist, Sarah, usually looks up with a practiced, professional smile. Today, she didn't. She looked at her monitor, then at the floor, then back at her monitor. She didn't say, "Good morning, Jonathan." She didn't say anything at all. I felt the shift immediately. It was a coldness that had nothing to do with the building's HVAC system. It was the atmospheric pressure of a reputation being dismantled in real time. I walked toward my corner office, passing the glass-walled cubicles of the junior associates. Usually, there's a hum of activity phones ringing, hushed debates over case law, the frantic tapping of keyboards. Today, there was a strange, performative stillness. As I passed, heads bowed, shoulders turned away. It was the kind of silence you find at a funeral where no one liked the deceased. I sat down at my mahogany desk and opened my laptop. My inbox was surprisingly quiet for 8:03 a.m. No urgent memos from Victoria Ames. No check-ins from Robert Klein. Then I saw it. An email sent at 3:14 a.m. The subject line was clinical, almost surgical. R.E. Mercer Acquisition, Structural Realignment. I wasn't the sender. I wasn't the primary recipient. I was BCC'd on a thread that had already been circulating for 6 hours. The email, drafted by Victoria Ames and approved by Robert Klein, was a masterpiece of corporate assassination. It didn't accuse me of a crime. It didn't cite a failure. It simply stated that in the interest of project continuity and specialized oversight, all lead responsibilities for the Mercer acquisition, the largest deal in our firm's history, were being transferred to Nathan Brooks. My name was mentioned only once in the final paragraph. We thank Jonathan for his preliminary contributions. Preliminary. After 18 months of 80-hour weeks, after navigating the regulatory minefield that would have buried any other consultant, I was being erased. I felt a surge of heat crawl up my neck, a primal instinct to stand up, walk into Victoria's office, and demand an explanation. But I didn't. I stayed in my chair. I breathed. I realized that if they were doing this publicly, they had already decided I was a casualty. To react was to give them the footage they needed for my instability. I stayed silent because I knew something they didn't. Or rather, I knew something they had forgotten in their haste to crown Nathan Brooks. Nathan was a closer, a charismatic shark who looked great in a tailored suit and even better on a witness stand. But Nathan didn't read the fine print. He didn't understand the nuances of the Section 4B compliance filings I had spent 3 months perfecting. He saw the deal as a trophy. I saw it as a clock with 10,000 moving parts. I looked through the glass of my office door. Across the hall, Nathan was already in the small conference room with Victoria. They were laughing. Nathan was gesturing toward a whiteboard, erasing my diagrams and replacing them with his own bold, simplistic arrows. He looked like a man who had just won a war without firing a single shot. Victoria was nodding, her expression one of immense relief. She had finally neutralized the one person who could see through her aggressive accounting strategies. I checked my personal phone. A text from Melissa Carter in compliance. "Jonathan, did you see the realignment memo? We need to talk about the Mercer audit trail. Something isn't lining up." I didn't reply. Not yet. I needed to see how far they were willing to go. I needed to see if they truly believed they could operate the machine I had built without the operator. That was the moment I understood that my power didn't come from my title or my office. It came from the silence I was currently maintaining. Every second I didn't scream. Every minute I didn't defend myself. I was building a vacuum. And in a firm like Sterling and Hale, a vacuum is eventually filled by a disaster. I watched Nathan Brooks walk past my office carrying a stack of files that I had compiled. He didn't even look in. He was already living in a world where I didn't exist. I sat there for 4 hours. I didn't make a single call. I didn't send a single email. I watched the firm move around me like I was a ghost. I saw the way Robert Klein looked at me through the glass during his lunch break, a mixture of pity and a strange, flickering uncertainty. He expected a confrontation. He expected me to beg for my seat at the table. When I simply looked back at him with a calm, neutral expression, he looked away first. The social imbalance was palpable. In the break room, the silence would follow me like a shadow. People would stop talking the moment I entered. They would look at their watches. They would find reasons to leave. This was the isolation phase. They wanted me to quit. They wanted me to disappear quietly so they wouldn't have to deal with the messy reality of a wrongful termination or a public fallout. But they had miscalculated my threshold for discomfort. By 4:30 p.m., the first crack appeared. It wasn't a loud crack. It was a soft, frantic knocking on Victoria's door. Nathan Brooks came out 3 minutes later looking slightly less confident. He was holding a document, one of my documents, and he was pointing at a highlighted section. Victoria followed him out, her brow furrowed. They looked toward my office, then quickly looked away. They were realizing that the preliminary contributions were actually the foundation of the entire deal. I stayed silent because the truth doesn't need a spokesperson. It only needs time. I watched them retreat back into the conference room. I knew exactly what they were looking for. They were looking for the clearance codes and the secondary audit logs that I had moved to a secure, offline server 3 days ago for security reasons. They thought they had the keys to the kingdom. They didn't realize I had changed the locks. As the sun began to set over the Manhattan skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across my office floor, I realized that the humiliation wasn't mine. It was a debt they were incurring, and the interest on that debt was growing by the hour. I packed my briefcase with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who has all the time in the world. I wasn't leaving because I was defeated. I was leaving because the stage was set. I walked toward the elevator, the same way I had entered. This time, I didn't look at Sarah, the receptionist. I didn't look at the junior associates. I kept my gaze fixed on the doors. Just as the elevator arrived, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Thomas Reed, the client representative for the Mercer acquisition. He looked worried. "Jonathan," he whispered, looking around to make sure we were alone. "I just heard about the shift. Nathan says he's got everything under control, but the numbers in the latest briefing, they don't look like yours." I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled all day. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of absolute, terrifying clarity. "Nathan is a very capable man, Thomas," I said quietly. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside and turned to face him. I'm sure he'll find exactly what he's looking for, eventually. As the doors closed, I saw the look of pure, unadulterated panic cross Thomas Reed's face. He knew, and I knew, that eventually was a luxury the Mercer acquisition didn't have. Section 2. A conference room that suddenly felt smaller. The following Tuesday, I was summoned to Conference Room B. It wasn't an invitation, it was a mandate. Conference Room B is where the firm handles internal adjustments. It's a windowless box designed to make you feel as though the walls are closing in. When I entered, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and expensive cologne. Victoria Ames was at the head of the table. Nathan Brooks was to her right, his laptop open, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the table. Robert Klein sat at the far end, his hands folded, watching me with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. "Jonathan, thank you for joining us," Victoria said. Her voice was clipped, professional, and entirely devoid of the warmth we had shared for a decade. "We're just doing a final walkthrough of the Mercer filing before the midnight deadline. Nathan had a few questions regarding the data encryption protocols you initiated." I didn't sit down. I stood at the foot of the table, my hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. I noticed there wasn't a chair laid out for me. I was a guest in my own project. "I'm happy to help, Victoria," I said, though as per the realignment memo, I understood that Nathan was now the sole authority on all filing procedures. Nathan cleared his throat. He didn't look at me. He looked at his screen. "Right. Well, Jonathan, there's a slight issue. The compliance portal is asking for a triple-factor authentication key that isn't in the transition folder. I'm sure it's just a clerical oversight." I stayed silent for a few seconds. I let the silence hang in the air until it became heavy, until Nathan had to look up. "That's not an oversight, Nathan," I said calmly. "That's a security protocol mandated by the new federal guidelines. I mentioned it in the briefing last month. You were on your phone at the time, I believe." Nathan's face flushed a deep, mottled red. Victoria's eyes sharpened. This was the humiliation I had expected. They had tried to push me out, and now they had to ask for the very thing they thought they had stolen. I realized then that my endurance was my greatest weapon. By not fighting the reassignment, I had allowed them to walk into a trap of their own making. They had assumed that my work was a product they could just take. They didn't realize my work was a process they had to understand. "Can you just give us the key, Jonathan?" Victoria asked. Her tone was no longer professional. It was demanding. It was the tone of someone who was losing control and trying to hide it with volume. "I could," I said, "but the protocol requires a manual override from the lead consultant. Since I am no longer the lead, the system has locked my credentials out of the primary server. It's an automated safety feature to prevent unauthorized access." The room grew even smaller. I could see the sweat beads forming on Nathan's upper lip. Robert Klein finally spoke. "Are you saying you can't access the filing, Jonathan?" "I'm saying the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, Robert," I replied. "It is protecting the client's data from anyone who isn't explicitly authorized by the final audit trail. Since Nathan's authorization hasn't been fully vetted by the compliance department yet, the system sees him as a threat." I looked at Nathan. He looked small. His expensive suit seemed to swallow him. He had spent the last week bragging about his new role, taking the senior partners out to dinner and promising a seamless transition. Now he was staring at a permission-denied screen with 6 hours left on a billion-dollar clock. The status threat was no longer mine, it was his. If this filing didn't go through, Nathan Brooks wouldn't just lose a case, he would lose his career. I stayed silent because I wanted them to feel the weight of their decision. I wanted them to feel the cold, hard reality of competence. You can't faking a compliance filing. You can't charm a server. You can't lobby an algorithm. I saw the moment Victoria realized the magnitude of the mistake. She looked at Robert, and for the first time in my career, I saw her look afraid. "Melissa Carter from Compliance is on her way up," Victoria said, her voice shaking slightly. "She'll sort this out." As if on cue, Melissa Carter walked into the room. She wasn't smiling. She was carrying a tablet and a stack of folders. She didn't look at Victoria or Nathan. She looked straight at me. "Jonathan," she said, "I've been reviewing the audit trail. Why wasn't the department notified of the lead change until 48 hours after the fact?" "I assume the transition team was handling the notifications, Melissa," I said. Melissa turned to Victoria. "The transition team? Victoria, you know the rules. A lead change on a deal this size requires a full security revetting. That takes 72 hours. The filing is due in 6. Because you didn't follow the protocol, the system has flagged this entire deal as a potential internal breach. I can't override this. No one can." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a sinking ship. Nathan Brooks looked like he was going to be sick. Victoria was staring at the table, her hands trembling. Robert Klein stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. He was a man who valued one thing above all else: results. And right now, the results were pointing toward a catastrophe. I stayed silent because I knew the next move wasn't mine to make. I had observed their betrayal. I had endured their humiliation. I had watched them take my credit and my office. And now I was watching them realize that they had forgotten to take my brain. The rising psychological pressure in the room was almost physical. It was the pressure of $1 billion evaporating because of an ego. "Is there a way around this, Melissa?" Robert asked, his back still to the room. "Only one," Melissa said. She looked at me. "If the original lead consultant, the one whose credentials are baked into the encryption signs, off on a manual emergency bypass, but that requires a formal declaration that the transition was a mistake and that the original lead is still in full control of the filing." The room felt like it had run out of oxygen. To save the deal, Victoria and Robert would have to publicly admit that removing me was a mistake. They would have to reinstate me in front of the entire firm. They would have to humble themselves before the man they had tried to destroy. I looked at Victoria. She looked at me. There was no more coldness in her eyes. There was only a desperate, silent plea. She wanted me to save her. She wanted me to step in and fix the mess she had created. I stayed silent. I didn't offer a solution. I didn't say I would do it. I just waited. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how much their pride was worth. I wanted to see if they would rather lose the firm's biggest client or their own dignity. Finally, Robert Klein turned around. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago. He looked at Nathan, then at Victoria, and then finally his eyes settled on me. "Jonathan," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "what do you need to make this work?" I looked at my watch. 5 hours and 40 minutes left. I didn't answer him immediately. I let the clock tick. I let Nathan Brooks squirm. I let Nathan Brooks squirm. I let Victoria Ames hold her breath. "I don't need anything, Robert," I said quietly, "but the system needs the truth. And right now, the truth is that Nathan Brooks doesn't have the authority to be in this room." I turned toward the door, my hand on the handle. I felt the power shift in the room like a tectonic plate. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was just inevitable. I was halfway out the door when I heard Robert's voice again. "Victoria," Robert said, his voice cold and final. "Write the retraction, now though." I stopped. I didn't turn around. I just waited. I knew what was coming next, but I needed to hear them say it. I needed to hear the sound of their silent dominance crumbling. "And Jonathan," Robert added. "Yes, Robert, don't leave the building." I closed the door behind me and walked back to my office. The hallway was still quiet, but the atmosphere had changed again. The junior associates were looking at me, but the pity was gone. It had been replaced by something else. Fear? Respect? It didn't matter. I sat back down at my mahogany desk and waited for the email that I knew was about to be sent. But as I waited, my phone buzzed. It was a private message from an unknown number. "You think you've won, Jonathan? You have no idea what Victoria is actually hiding in those files." Section 3. When credit starts traveling without you. The retraction email hit the firm's servers at 6:04 p.m. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, a linguistic dance designed to save face while crawling back to the only person who could stop the bleeding. Robert Klein's name was at the bottom, but the prose had Victoria Ames's cold, calculated fingerprints all over it. It didn't say I was right. It said there had been a misalignment of technical oversight. It didn't say Nathan Brooks had failed. It said the project required senior-level continuity. I watched the notifications pop up on my screen. One by one, the junior associates who had spent the day avoiding my gaze began to ping me. "Glad to have you back on Mercer, Jonathan," one wrote. "Let me know if you need the latest data sets," another chimed in. I didn't reply to any of them. The silence I had cultivated wasn't just a shield, it was now a filter. I was learning exactly who moved with the wind and who stood their ground. I walked back into the main war room. The atmosphere had shifted from a funeral to a triage unit. Nathan Brooks was still there, but he was no longer at the head of the table. He was sitting in a corner, his laptop closed, his eyes fixed on the floor. Victoria was standing by the window, her back to me. She didn't turn around when I entered. She didn't need to. She knew the sound of my footsteps. She knew the sound of her own defeat. "The manual bypass is ready, Jonathan," Melissa Carter said, her voice steady and professional. She handed me the tablet. "The system is waiting for your biometric signature. Once you sign, the filing window reopens for 4 hours. But there's a catch. The federal server will log this as an emergency correction. It triggers an automatic secondary audit by the SEC next month." "We can't avoid it now." I looked at the screen. My name was back where it belonged, lead consultant. But below it, Nathan's name was still listed as secondary oversight. They were trying to keep him attached to the success, even after he had nearly caused the failure. They wanted the credit to travel with him to ensure his high-potential trajectory remained intact. It was a classic move. Use the workhorse to fix the mess, but keep the thoroughbred in the winner's circle. I stayed silent as I reviewed the filing documents. I didn't sign immediately. I spent 30 minutes checking every single line of code, every comma, every decimal point. I knew Nathan had been in these files. I knew he had tried to streamline the compliance ratios to make the deal look more profitable for the firm's bonus pool. I saw the small, subtle changes he had made, the kind of changes that look like efficiency but smell like fraud. I realized then that this wasn't just about a power struggle. It was about a fundamental difference in philosophy. To Victoria and Nathan, the law was a set of hurdles to be jumped or bypassed. To me, it was the track itself. If you leave the track, you aren't running the race anymore. You're just a person in a suit, lost in the woods. I began to quietly undo his improvements, restoring the integrity of the original filing. "We don't have time for a full audit, Jonathan," Victoria said, finally turning around. Her face was a mask of strained composure. "Just sign the bypass. We need to hit the window. Thomas Reed is on the phone with the board every 10 minutes. They're losing their minds." "I'm not signing a fraudulent filing, Victoria," I said quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The word fraudulent carries its own volume. The room went cold. Nathan looked up, his eyes widening. Victoria stepped toward me, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "Don't be dramatic. Nathan just cleaned up some of the legacy data. It's a standard optimization. No one is going to look at the secondary ratios." "The SEC will," I replied, pointing to the audit trigger Melissa had just mentioned. "And when they do, they won't look at Nathan. They'll look at the person who signed the bypass. That would be me. I'm not going to be the fall man for a bonus padding scheme." I stayed silent because I wanted the weight of that statement to settle. I wanted them to understand that I wasn't just protecting the deal. I was protecting myself. And in doing so, I was holding their greed hostage. The psychological pressure was shifting again. They needed me to sign to save the deal, but I wouldn't sign until the deal was actually worth saving. Nathan stood up, his voice cracking slightly. I didn't pad anything. I reorganized the reporting structure. You changed the liability disclosures, Nathan, I said, looking him dead in the eye. You moved $40 million in potential environmental litigation into a miscellaneous column. That's not reorganization. That's a felony. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of a trapped animal. Victoria looked at Nathan, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her face. She hadn't known. Or, more likely, she had told him to make it work and hadn't asked how. Now, the how was staring her in the face, and it had my signature requirement attached to it. I watched the clock. 3 hours and 12 minutes left. I stayed silent, waiting for them to make the only move they had left. I wasn't the one under pressure anymore. I was the one holding the stopwatch. I realized that my power didn't come from my expertise. It came from my willingness to walk away from a tainted success. "Fix it," Victoria whispered. She looked at Nathan with a loathing that was almost visceral. "Fix it now, Jonathan. Whatever you need to do. Just get it clean." I didn't move. I didn't start typing. I just looked at her. I need Nathan to leave the room, and I need his access to the firm's servers revoked immediately. For security reasons, it was a total decapitation. Nathan Brooks, the golden boy, the chosen successor, was being treated like a rogue element. He looked at Victoria, hoping for a defense, for a stay of execution. She didn't even look at him. She just nodded. "Nathan, go home. We'll discuss your future in the morning." As Nathan walked out, his head bowed, his reputation trailing behind him like a tattered flag, I felt no joy. I felt only the quiet satisfaction of a world returning to its proper axis. I began to work, my fingers moving across the keys with a precision that comes from a decade of discipline. I was no longer a ghost. I was the architect, and the building was finally standing on solid ground. But as I reached the final layer of the encryption, I found something I didn't expect. It wasn't a change Nathan had made. It was an older entry, a hidden ledger that had been buried in the system for years, long before Nathan Brooks even joined the firm. It was a set of instructions for a recurring wire transfer, masked as a compliance fee. The recipient wasn't a government agency. It was a shell company registered in Delaware, and the person who had authorized the original setup wasn't Victoria Ames. I stayed silent, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the name on the authorization form. That was the moment I understood that the betrayal I had experienced wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, much more dangerous machine. Section 4. I learned who benefited from my silence. The name on the digital authorization form was Robert Klein, our managing partner, the man who sat in the corner office with the panoramic view of the Hudson. The man who had just stood by and watched Victoria try to dismantle my career. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses. The wire transfers were small enough to avoid most automated flags, but over 12 years they totaled over $8 million. I stayed silent because I realized that my sidelining wasn't just about Victoria's ego or Nathan's ambition. It was a preventative strike. I was the only one in the firm with the technical literacy to find this. By pushing me out, by making me a consultant emeritus or a casualty of a realignment, they were ensuring that the Mercer acquisition audit, the biggest audit in the firm's history, would be handled by someone like Nathan. Someone who wouldn't look too closely. Someone who was too busy chasing credit to notice the cracks in the foundation. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had spent 12 years loyal to a man who saw me as a potential threat to his retirement fund. I looked toward the door. Victoria was still in the hall, talking frantically on her phone. She was probably telling Thomas Reed that everything was under control. She had no idea that she was just as much of a pawn as I was. Robert had used her ambition to neutralize my competence. I checked the timestamps on the hidden ledger. The most recent transfer had been triggered only 2 hours ago, right in the middle of the chaos in the conference room. Robert was using the technical glitch as a smokescreen to move one last lump sum before the SEC audit hit. He knew the audit was coming. He had probably planned for it. He just needed someone to blame when the numbers didn't add up. I stayed silent because I needed to think 3 steps ahead. If I reported this now, the deal would collapse. The firm would go under. Hundreds of people would lose their jobs. And Robert Klein, with his $8 million in his offshore accounts, would likely disappear before the first subpoena was even drafted. I needed more than just a discovery. I needed leverage. I needed to ensure that when the truth came out, it didn't take me down with it. I began to copy the ledger, not to the firm's servers, but to a physical hardware key I kept in my desk. I moved slowly, deliberately. Every click of the mouse felt like a heartbeat. I was no longer just a legal consultant. I was a witness. I was the only person who knew the true cost of the Mercer acquisition. The pressure was no longer about a deadline. It was about survival. I realized that my silence during the day had been my greatest asset. Because I hadn't fought back, they thought I was broken. They thought I was just grateful to have my job back. They didn't see me as a threat anymore. They saw me as a tool. And a tool doesn't look for hidden ledgers. A tool just does what it's told. I finished the bypass. I signed the filing. The system hummed, and a green progress bar began to crawl across the screen. Filing submitted successfully. I felt a hollow sense of accomplishment. I had saved the firm's biggest deal, but I had also just provided the cover for Robert Klein's final payout. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the office pressing in on me. "Is it done?" Victoria asked, appearing in the doorway. She looked exhausted. The bravado was gone, replaced by a desperate need for the day to be over. "It's done, Victoria," I said. I handed her the tablet. "The Mercer acquisition is officially on the federal record. Clean, compliant, perfect." "Thank God," she whispered. She leaned against the doorframe, closing her eyes. "I'm sorry about the realignment, Jonathan." It was Robert's idea. He felt we needed a fresher approach for the final phase. I should have pushed back harder. She was lying. Or at least she was telling the version of the truth that kept her safe. I stayed silent, watching her. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't offer anger. I just offered a neutral, professional nod. I was learning that in this world, words are just currency, and right now, her currency was worthless. "I'm going to head out," I said, packing my briefcase. "It's been a long day." "Of course," she said. "See you in the morning, Jonathan. We'll have a proper debrief." I walked out of the office, through the quiet lobby, and into the elevator. The descent felt faster than the ascent. As I stepped out into the cool night air of Manhattan, my phone buzzed. It was a call from Thomas Reed. I hesitated, then answered. "Jonathan," Thomas said, his voice low and urgent. "I just got the confirmation on the filing. Thank you. I know it was difficult. It's part of the job, Thomas," I said, walking toward the shop. "Thomas," I said, walking toward the subway. "Listen," he continued, "I need to meet you tomorrow. Before you go into the office, there's something about the Mercer payment structure that Robert Klein didn't disclose to our board. I think he's trying to bypass our internal compliance." I stopped walking. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, wavering shadows. The realization that the client representative was also in the dark changed everything. This wasn't just an internal firm matter. It was a multi-party fraud. "Where and when, Thomas?" I asked. "The diner on 4th, 7:30 a.m. And Jonathan, don't tell anyone, especially not Victoria." I hung up the phone. I looked up at the towering glass and steel of the Sterling and Hale building. It looked like a monument to stability, to honor, to the rule of law. But I knew better now. I knew that it was a shell, held together by the very silence I was currently maintaining. I stayed silent because the next move wasn't just about my reputation anymore. It was about justice. A quiet, restrained, and inevitable justice that would leave no one untouched. I realized that by removing my name from the case, they had given me the one thing they couldn't control, my freedom to watch them fall. As I walked into the subway station, I saw a headline on a discarded newspaper, "Mercer Deal Finalized, a New Era for American Law." I smiled. It was indeed a new era, but not the one they were expecting. Section 5. Processes. Don't forget, people do. The diner on 4th was a relic of a different era, a place of cracked vinyl booths and the smell of burnt grease. It was the last place anyone from Sterling and Hale would be seen. That was exactly why Thomas Reed chose it. I arrived at 6:05 a.m. The city was just waking up, a gray mist clinging to the pavement. I saw Thomas in the back corner. He wasn't wearing his usual bespoke suit. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, his eyes bloodshot, his movements twitchy and nervous. He had a manila folder resting on the table, his hand covering it, as if someone might snatch it away. I sat down across from him. I didn't order coffee. I didn't offer a greeting. I stayed silent because I wanted him to be the one to break the tension. In a negotiation, the first person to speak usually loses the most ground. Thomas looked at me, then at the folder, then back at me. He seemed to be searching for the version of Jonathan Hale he knew, the loyal, hard-working consultant who followed orders. He didn't find him. He found someone who was simply waiting for the inevitable. "I went through the escrow accounts last night," Thomas began, his voice barely a whisper. "The board was told the compliance fees for the Mercer acquisition were fixed at 4%, but the ledger I received from Robert's office shows 5.5. That's a difference of $12 million, Jonathan. $12 million that disappeared into a subledger marked administrative contingency." I didn't blink. I didn't act surprised. I reached for the folder, opened it slowly, and compared the numbers to the ones I had burned into my memory from the night before. It matched perfectly. The shell company in Delaware, the one I had discovered, was the destination for that contingency. Robert Klein wasn't just skimming from his partners, he was stealing from the very clients who kept the firm alive. It was a level of arrogance that usually precedes a total collapse. "I realized then," I said, my voice calm and low, "that the realignment wasn't about Nathan Brooks. It was about creating a gap in the record. If I had stayed as the lead, I would have seen the escrow discrepancies during the final audit. By removing me, Robert bought himself a window of time. He thought Nathan wouldn't have the experience to look beneath the surface." "Can we stop it?" Thomas asked. He looked desperate. "If the board finds out we signed off on a deal with a $12 million hole, they'll liquidate the entire acquisition. My career is over. Your firm is over." I stayed silent for a long moment. I looked out the window at the early morning commuters. They were all rushing toward lives that felt stable and predictable. Inside this diner, the world was fracturing. I realized that the power I held wasn't just about the filing anymore. It was about the narrative. I had the evidence of the fraud, the evidence of the betrayal, and the technical keys to prove it all. But I couldn't move yet. If I struck too early, Robert would use the firm's resources to bury me before the truth reached the light. "Processes don't forget, Thomas," I said. "People do. Robert thinks he's smarter than the system he built. He thinks he can delete a line of code and the reality will change. But every transaction leaves a ghost. I've already found the original authorization. It has Robert's digital signature." Thomas leaned in, his face pale. "What are you going to do with it?" I'm going to do nothing," I replied. The confusion on his face was almost comical. "I'm going to go to the office. I'm going to sit at my desk, and I'm going to wait for the system to do its job. The SEC audit I triggered yesterday is already in motion. Robert thinks he has weeks. He doesn't. He has hours." I stood up, leaving the folder on the table. I didn't need it. I had the digital copies, and more importantly, I had the original metadata. I walked out of the diner without looking back. The psychological pressure was no longer a weight on my shoulders. It was a weapon I was preparing to fire. By remaining silent, by appearing to be the compliant employee, I was allowing Robert to walk further into the trap. He was currently in his office, likely celebrating the success of the Mercer filing, unaware that the floor beneath him was already gone. I arrived at the office at 8:15 a.m. The atmosphere was different again. The tension from the previous day had evolved into a strange, frantic energy. Victoria Ames was standing by the reception desk, arguing with a man in a dark gray suit. I recognized the insignia on the man's lapel. SEC Enforcement Division. They were early, much earlier than even I had anticipated. I stayed silent as I walked past them. I didn't stop to ask what was happening. I didn't offer to help. I walked straight to my office and sat down. I saw Victoria look at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and realization. She knew I was the one who signed the bypass. She knew I was the only one who could explain the technical glitches to the federal investigators. She started toward my office. Her pace hurried, but she was stopped by another investigator. "Mr. Hale," a voice called out. I looked up. It was Melissa Carter from Compliance. She was standing in my doorway, and for the first time in the 5 years I'd known her, she looked genuinely terrified. "Robert wants to see you. Now. He said it's about the Mercer audit trail. He's in the main boardroom." I stood up and straightened my jacket. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. This was the moment of confirmed betrayal. Robert was going to try to pin the discrepancies on the man who signed the final bypass. He was going to use my reinstatement as the evidence that I was the one in control of the numbers. He was going to try to make me the architect of his theft. I stayed silent because I knew that every word I said from this point forward was a matter of legal record. I walked toward the boardroom, passing Nathan Brooks's empty office. His nameplate was already gone. They had discarded him the moment he was no longer useful. I realized that Robert saw the entire world as a collection of disposable parts. He just didn't realize that some parts are structural. I entered the boardroom. Robert Klein was sitting at the head of the table. He looked composed, but his hands were gripped tightly around a glass of water. Victoria was there too, sitting as far away from him as possible. The two SEC investigators were at the other end, their laptops open, their expressions unreadable. "Jonathan," Robert said, his voice smooth and paternal, "thank you for coming. We were just explaining to the investigators that you took over the final filing protocols yesterday. There seemed to be some irregularities in the escrow allocations. I'm sure you can walk us through the logic behind your entries." "He was doing it. He was laying the foundation for my professional execution." He was smiling at me, expecting me to stumble, to defend myself, to show weakness. I looked at him, then at the investigators. I didn't look at the screen. I didn't look at the documents. I stayed silent for 10 seconds, a lifetime in a room like that. The silence stretched until Robert's smile began to falter. "Actually, Robert," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I think we should look at the physical logs from the Delaware server, the ones that were authorized before I was even reinstated." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. I didn't hand it to Robert, I handed it directly to the lead investigator. Section 6. Why my absence became inconvenient. The lead investigator, a man named Miller, took the drive with a gloved hand. The room went so silent I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Robert Klein didn't move. He didn't blink, but I saw the pulse in his neck jump. It was a small, involuntary admission of guilt. Victoria Ames looked like she was about to faint. She had spent the last 24 hours trying to decide which side to be on, and she had just realized she had chosen the losing one. "What is this, Mr. Hale?" Miller asked, his eyes never leaving mine. "That is a complete mirror of the internal communication logs from the period I was removed from the Mercer project," I said. "It includes the authorization codes for the escrow adjustments. You'll find they were issued from a terminal that doesn't belong to the lead consultant's office. In fact, they were issued from a remote login while I was officially barred from the firm's network." I stayed silent because I wanted the implication to sink in. If I was locked out, I couldn't have made the changes. And if the changes were made during my absence, the realignment wasn't a management decision, it was a forensic opportunity. I watched Robert's face transform. The paternal mask shattered, replaced by a cold, predatory sneer. He realized that my silence over the last few days hadn't been submission. It had been a countdown. "This is a desperate attempt by a disgruntled employee to shift blame," Robert said, his voice gaining a sharp, dangerous edge. "Jonathan was sidelined because of performance issues. He forced his way back into the project by withholding the encryption keys. This drive is likely tampered with." I didn't argue. I didn't defend my performance. I stayed silent because the truth was already moving past him. I looked at Melissa Carter, who was standing by the door. She knew the truth. She was the one who had seen the audit trail first. She was the one who had tipped me off. She looked at Robert, then at me, and then she walked into the room and sat down next to the investigators. "It's not tampered with," Melissa said, her voice trembling but certain. "I've already verified the server logs. Jonathan is right. The authorizations came from Robert's private account. I have the secondary timestamps to prove it. I was told to ignore them. Victoria told me it was a partner-level adjustment." The betrayal was now complete. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I never! Robert told me it was a tax strategy. He said it was a tax strategy. He said it was for the client's benefit." The room dissolved into a quiet, corporate chaos. There was no shouting, no dramatic accusations, just the sound of people realizing that the walls they had built to protect themselves were actually made of glass. I stayed silent because I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was the observer. I had moved from the role of the humiliated victim to the invisible judge. "I think we need to clear the room," Miller said, looking at Robert. "Mr. Klein, we have enough to initiate a formal freeze on the Mercer escrow accounts. We'll need your primary credentials and your legal counsel present." Robert stood up. He didn't look at the investigators. He looked at me. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He had spent 30 years building Sterling & Hale into a powerhouse, and he had just watched it crumble because he underestimated the man who did the actual work. He walked toward the door, his gait stiff, his authority evaporating with every step. Victoria followed him, her face a mask of tears and panic. She was realizing that being a senior partner wouldn't save her from the fallout of being a silent accomplice. As they left, the boardroom felt suddenly cavernous. The power hierarchy that had defined my life for a decade had been decapitated in under 10 minutes. I stayed silent as the investigators began their work. I didn't offer to stay. I didn't ask for a promotion. I didn't ask what would happen next. I knew what would happen. The firm would enter a state of total paralysis. Clients would flee. The Mercer deal would be tied up in litigation for years. And I was the only person who knew how to untangle the mess. My absence, which they had worked so hard to engineer, had suddenly become the most inconvenient thing in the world for them. I walked back to my office. People were standing in the hallways in small, hushed groups. They watched me pass, but no one spoke. The fear I had seen earlier had turned into a profound, unsettling respect. They realized that I hadn't just survived the attack, I had anticipated it. I had used their own greed and their own processes to erase them. I sat down at my desk and began to clear my personal items. I wasn't waiting for a termination notice. I was leaving on my own terms. I realized that my reputation hadn't been destroyed by the realignment. It had been refined. I was the man who stayed silent while the giants fell. I was the man who knew where the ghosts lived. As I was packing my last notebook, Nathan Brooks appeared at the door. He looked disheveled, his tie crooked. He had heard the news. "Jonathan," he stammered, I didn't know. I thought it was just a promotion. I didn't know what Robert was doing." I looked at him. He was a shell of a man, a charismatic shark who had found himself in a pool with no water. "It doesn't matter what you knew, Nathan," I said quietly. "It only matters what you did. You took the credit for work you did. You took the credit for work you didn't understand. That's a choice, and choices have consequences." I walked past him, my briefcase in hand. I didn't look back at the office. I didn't look back at the name on the door. I walked toward the elevator, the same 44-second ride I had taken thousands of times. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the silence of a man who had finally found his own voice by refusing to use theirs. As the elevator doors opened in the lobby, I saw Thomas Reed waiting for me. He looked relieved, but there was a new shadow in his eyes. "They're asking for you, Jonathan," he said. "The board. They want to know if you can lead the restructuring. They're offering whatever it takes." I stepped out into the lobby. I looked at the glass doors, the city beyond them, and the ruins of the firm behind me. I stayed silent for a moment, enjoying the weight of the decision. I realized that the power had shifted completely. I wasn't just a consultant anymore. I was the only one left standing. "Tell them I'm busy, Thomas," I said. "I have a reputation to maintain." Section 7. Authority shifted without an announcement. They offered me the corner office on the 42nd floor before the sun had even set on the day of Robert's departure. It was the office with the panoramic view of the Hudson River, the one I had walked past for 12 years. It was a gesture of desperation, a peace offering from a board of directors that was suddenly staring into an abyss of litigation and lost revenue. They didn't call it a promotion. They called it interim leadership for the sake of institutional stability. They wanted me to be the face of the cleanup. They wanted to use my name, the name they had tried to erase 48 hours ago, to signal to the market that Sterling and Hale was still a firm of integrity. I didn't sit in the chair. I stood by the window, looking out at the city, while the chairman of the board, a man named Marcus Thorne, spoke about legacy and shared values. Marcus was a man who spoke in the rhythms of a eulogy, his voice smooth and practiced, designed to soothe shareholders and silence dissent. He promised me a partnership share that surpassed Victoria's. He promised me a seat on the executive committee. He promised me everything I had once thought I wanted. I stayed silent because I realized that an office is just a cage with a better view if you don't own the keys to the locks. Marcus wasn't offering me authority. He was offering me a shield. He wanted me to stand between the firm and the SEC. He wanted my reputation to absorb the impact of Robert Klein's crimes. If I took the office, I would be tethered to the very rot I had just exposed. I would be the man who saved the firm, which meant I would be the man responsible for its future sins. "I'm not interested in the office, Marcus," I said, finally turning away from the window. My voice was calm, lacking the excitement or the gratitude he expected. "And I'm not interested in the interim title." Titles are how you control people who are afraid of being invisible. I've already been invisible. It didn't stop me from seeing the truth. The psychological pressure in the room shifted instantly. Marcus had come prepared to negotiate with a man who had been humiliated. He hadn't prepared for a man who had found power in that humiliation. He looked at the empty mahogany desk, then back at me. "Jonathan, be reasonable. The firm is at a breaking point. Without a strong lead on the Mercer cleanup, we lose the client. If we lose the client, the partnership dissolves by the end of the quarter." "Then let it dissolve," I replied. I watched the color drain from his face. It was a quiet, clinical observation. I wasn't being cruel. I was being honest. The firm didn't fail because of Robert's greed. It failed because the system allowed that greed to become a strategy. You all saw the realignment memo. You all saw my name being stripped from the case. None of you called me. None of you asked why. I stayed silent because I wanted him to feel the weight of his own complicity. The silence stretched, becoming an indictment. Marcus looked at his hands, then at the floor. He knew I was right. He knew that their silence had been an investment in Robert's success, and now that the investment had turned toxic, they were looking for a bailout. I realized that my dominance didn't come from my expertise in the law. It came from the fact that I no longer needed their approval. "What do you want, then?" Marcus asked, his voice losing its polished edge. He sounded like a man who was finally speaking the truth because he had run out of lies. "I want the Mercer file to be handled with total transparency," I said. "No administrative contingencies, no miscellaneous columns, and I want the authority to vet every senior partner's billing records for the last 5 years. If I stay, I don't stay to lead a firm. I stay to conduct an autopsy." It was a demand for total, unchecked power over the firm's elite. It was the ultimate reversal of status. I was no longer a consultant asking for a seat at the table. I was the examiner deciding who deserved to keep theirs. Marcus hesitated. He knew that what I was asking for would destroy the careers of at least 3 other partners who had likely benefited from Robert's accounting strategies. "That's a scorched earth policy, Jonathan," he whispered. "You'll leave nothing behind." "I'll leave a reputation that is actually earned," I replied. "Which is more than this firm has had for a decade." I stayed silent, waiting for the inevitable surrender. I knew he had no choice. The SEC was currently in the conference room downstairs, and Thomas Reed was waiting in my old, small office with a list of demands from the Mercer board. I was the only bridge between the firm and survival. The rising pressure wasn't mine to bear anymore. It was theirs. They had to decide if they wanted to survive as a skeleton of a firm or die as a monument to a lie. "Fine," Marcus said, his shoulders sagging. "You have the authority, but God help us if you find what I think you're going to find." I didn't answer him. I walked out of the corner office and headed toward the elevator. I didn't go to the boardroom. I didn't go to see the SEC. I went down to the lobby and stepped out onto the street. I needed to breathe air that didn't smell like desperation and expensive carpet. I realized that the authority had shifted without a single announcement. It hadn't happened when Robert left. It hadn't happened when I got the office. It happened the moment I realized I was willing to let it all burn. As I walked toward my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. I answered it, expecting another frantic board member. Instead, it was a voice I hadn't heard in 48 hours. "You think you're the hero now, Jonathan?" Victoria Ames's voice was shaky, filtered through what sounded like a cheap headset. "You think you're the only one who knows how to play this game? Look at the Section 7 filings from 3 years ago, the ones you didn't check because you trusted me. We're all in the water, Jonathan. Some of us just haven't realized we're drowning yet." I stayed silent, the cold wind of the city biting at my face. I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I hung up the phone. But as I stood under the flickering lights of the subway entrance, I realized the trap was deeper than I had imagined. Section 8. What remains after reputation corrects itself? The final audit of Sterling and Hale took 6 months. It was a period of absolute clinical silence. I didn't give interviews. I didn't attend industry galas. I spent 12 hours a day in a windowless room on the 30th floor, surrounded by a team of independent forensic accountants I had hired from outside the legal world. We went through every ledger, every email, every Section 7 filing that Victoria had mentioned in her final desperate call. I found exactly what she had implied. 3 years ago, during a smaller acquisition, a series of documents had been filed with my digital signature. They were small errors, omissions of liability that favored the firm's quarterly numbers. I stayed silent because I understood the brilliance of the move. Victoria hadn't just betrayed me at the end. She had been building a failure point into my record for years. If I ever became a threat, she could point to those filings and claim I was part of the corruption. That was the moment I understood that moral victory isn't about being perfect. It's about being the one who is willing to correct the record, even when the record includes your own mistakes. I didn't hide the filings. I didn't delete the evidence. I was the one who brought them to the SEC. I sat in a deposition for 14 hours and explained exactly how my trust had been weaponized against me, and I accepted the formal reprimand for oversight negligence without a single protest. By doing so, I took away the only weapon they had left. You cannot blackmail a man who has already told the truth about his own failures. I stayed silent because I knew that my reputation wasn't something I could protect with a PR firm or a legal defense. It was something that had to be rebuilt from the ground up, stone by painful stone. Robert Klein was indicted on 24 counts of wire fraud and racketeering. He didn't go to trial. He took a plea deal that stripped him of his assets and his license to practice law. I heard he moved to a small town in the Midwest, living on a pension that barely covered his legal fees. Victoria Ames disappeared into the world of private consulting, her name a whispered warning in the halls of Manhattan firms. She had saved her freedom, but she had lost her status. In the world we lived in, that was a fate worse than prison. Sterling and Hale no longer exists. It was rebranded as Hale & Associates after a full restructuring. I am no longer a consultant. I am the managing partner, though I rarely use the title. The corner office is now a communal library for the junior associates. I stayed in my old office, the one that felt smaller when the humiliation started. It serves as a reminder that authority isn't about the space you occupy. It's about the truth you represent. I stayed silent because I realized that the noise of the corporate world is designed to distract you from the inevitable. People think that power is loud. They think it's about winning arguments and commanding rooms. But real power is the ability to wait. It's the ability to watch the world try to erase you and to simply stay where you are until the world realizes it made a mistake. The Mercer acquisition was finalized, but under a new set of terms that I negotiated personally. Thomas Reed stayed on as the client representative. We don't talk about the night in the diner. We don't talk about the $12 million. We talk about the law. We talk about the process. We talk about the things that don't forget. As I sit at my desk on a quiet Tuesday evening, the office is nearly empty. The city lights are beginning to twinkle outside, a vast, complex machine that never stops moving. I look at the final report on the firm's restructuring. My name is at the top. It isn't bold. It isn't highlighted. It's just there. It belongs there. I realized that the quiet satisfaction I feel isn't from the victory. It's from the clarity. I was stripped of my title, my projects, and my reputation, and yet I am still here. They tried to remove me from the case, but they forgot that I was the case. I packed my briefcase and walked toward the elevator. Sarah, the new receptionist, looks up as I pass. She doesn't look at her monitor. She doesn't look at the floor. She smiles, a genuine professional smile. "Good night, Mr. Hale," she says. "Good night, Sarah," I reply. The elevator ride to the lobby takes exactly 44 seconds. I don't count them anymore. I don't need to. I know exactly where I am, and I know exactly where I'm going. Reputation isn't what people say about you when you're in the room. It's what the system does to protect itself when you're gone. And my reputation has finally corrected itself. I step out into the night air, the silence of the street, a perfect companion. The storm is over. The dust has settled. And what remains is the only thing that ever mattered, the truth, and the man who stayed silent long enough to hear it. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.